you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ICS Witnesses Seminar. My name is Yukti Pawar, and I'm a research intern at ICS Delhi. The topic for today's seminar is Rethinking the Southern Urban via a Tongbian framing of lands, property, relations, and territory, Mumbai's Malad and Hong Kong's Kowloon. The scholars of post-colonial shaped Southern urbanism across ideological persuasions could view Mumbai's fastest growing district, Malad, and Kowloon's Sham Shui to be set within a common narrative. Malad Mindspace and InOrbit Mall to future neighboring Somwari Bazar, densely packed industries, newcomers to Hong Kong's Kowloon cited slum-looking tenements with archaic, densely tenanted balconies would assume these to give away to cliched high-end cafes and malls housing Starbucks. Locating such territories as urban renewal, speculative urbanism, or where gentrification settles capital's frontier, built around accumulation by dispossession, ABD, leads to attempts to provincialize ABD and incorrectly locate such territories as slums and informal. Halvorsen rightly questions with such underlying dominant Anglophone perspective derived from the Westphalian state. However, for him, the South remains as hybrid sites of multiplicities and diversities rather than understood in terms of entangled interactions between different forces. In this talk, Professor Benjamin and Dr. Thang discuss their co-authored book with Rupali Gupte and Prashad Shetty, Land's Future Embeddedness in Property Relations and Territory. Here, a Tongbian understanding allows a serious consideration of the thickness of property with overlaid situated histories representing entangled and fluid relationships. This is central in analyzing change premised on difference without alienation rather than the idea of dialectics. This shift in approach allows us a conceptual entry into state spaces and practices that are otherwise represented again across ideological positions as patron clientelism, whose vote bank politics possess popular groups as deviant society, roped in as local agents of a global value chain. Now, a short introduction for our speakers today. Dr. Bingxing Thang was formerly professor at the Department of Geography and Research Fellow at Advanced Institute for Contemporary China Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University, China. With a PhD from Cambridge University and MSc in Urban and Regional Planning from University of Toronto, he is widely published to interrogate urban theories in China with special emphasis on town-country relations. Some of his questions include, what is urban ideology in China? How to contextualize it? Are debates about the differentiation between the city and urbanization relevant to China? And how can one interpret China's town-country relations within the politics and administration of the Chinese state? Dr. Solomon Benjamin is presently faculty at IIT Madras's Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. With a PhD from MIT's Department of Urban Studies, his work has focused on the triangulate, the very logics of land, whose tenurial specialities conceived as situated histories are explored around the concept of occupancy urbanism and entanglement of spaces and producing urban terrains beyond rationale of master planning, and how these two realms interconnect with the materiality of economy of mostly small firms as a neighborhood, as factory explored earlier in electrical cables and conductors, silk, machine tools, and more recently in terms of transnational connect to Shenzhen in smartphone re-engineering and refurbishment. Now, a short introduction to our chair for the today's seminar. Dr. Ritu Agarwal is an associate professor at Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She holds a PhD in Chinese Studies from University of Delhi and an MA in Political Science from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her doctoral work explored the micro-level agrarian transformation in Yunnan province, and she is currently engaged with questions of provisional transformation, especially in Yunnan. Her research interests are rural political economy, urbanization, gender studies, and provisional politics. Dr. Ritu Agarwal studied Mandarin Chinese at Beijing Language and Cultural University, Beijing. She was a visiting scholar at Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences, um, Kunming, and visiting fellow at Yunnan Minzu University and Yunnan University recently. She was also affiliated with the Chinese University of Hong Kong and East Asia Institute, National University of Singapore. Now, before I give the floor to our chair, I would like to highlight some housekeeping rules. All the participants will be muted during the session. The questions can be posted in the chat box during the seminar. You can also raise your hand option, or you can also use the raise a hand option to ask the question. You will be able to speak once the chair gives the floor to you for the same. And also the recording of the seminar will be posted on our YouTube channel, and it is currently being live streamed as well. Now, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Rita Agarwal, our chair for the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yukti. And let me once again extend my warm welcome to both the professors here who are going to speak on a very, very interesting topic. And I'm very happy to be part of this, very, very interesting seminar, Rethinking the Southern Urban via a Tongbian framing of lands, property relations, and territory, Mumbai's Malad and Hong Kong's Kowloon. Now, why I'm remembering, this Kowloon, I remember she is also mentioned when I was affiliated with Chinese University of Hong Kong. I remember visiting this Kowloon. What a fantastic, and the downtown area of Hong Kong, very bustling, and that is a time when many people were complaining that a lot of Chinese are coming to Hong Kong, and they are almost taking away our land. I mean, in the sense, the kind of facilities the Hong Kong people used to enjoy. So, I had a very fascinating memories because Chinese University of Hong Kong was, of course, a beautiful and very, enlightening place. And I think Kowloon was closer to that. It's very, old, kind of something like 10 years back. So I may sometime not recall back. And, I don't want to say much now because I think everybody's waiting with the PowerPoint presentation. But I just want to say things that Southern urban. So how we are going to, put this idea of a urban in these two Asian cities as juxtaposing against the global urbanism. So what are the transformation you are going to talk about? How they are, the land tenure relationship is not simply to be taken as a kind of a category of supply and demand. Rather, there is a kind of a belonging, memories, values which are attached to this land as a kind of a, as a fixed territory where the state in a way, adjust in a way also, remake and as well as, contest the territorial boundaries in significant ways. So the experience in India and Hong Kong is going to be very different than it was in China. So before saying much now, I open the floor, and I give the floor to Professor, I think Benjamin first. I think he's going to come first, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, over to you, Dr.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you all very much for arranging and giving us this opportunity. And we're hoping towards future conversations. And what I will do is we have our talk in. I hope you can all see the slide change that has happened. Is that right? Can you all see it?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay, so I'll give a very brief introduction because you want to keep as much time as for discussion. And then after I give this kind of a broad kind of an introduction to a group of us who've started to examine these issues. And this is really coming out of a recent journal article which we have framed, which is presently under review. And but we thought it'll be useful to use that as a basis to open up a discussion on how we think about the urban in more complicated ways. And I think I just want to clarify that we are not doing a comparison between Malad in Bombay and Kowloon in the Hong Kong area, but rather using this. In fact, that is one of our main arguments, that one has to look at the complexity of these spaces to be able to think about what constitutes the urban and the politics of it, including the politics of knowledge generation. So basically we have 5 parts. Professor Tang will look at he'll look at the Tongbian approach and as a critique of Western, quote unquote, Western theory. The third, I will look at Malad. I'll give you kind of illustrations. And after that, we look at some of the dominant ways in which the kind of Indian city has been framed, and finally looking at methods and pedagogy, because our intent is to kind of pose ways that there are really exciting ways of researching and teaching cities, which can kind of open space and agency to people who are doing field work and derive theory from there, rather than feeling burdened by theory that is built elsewhere, but to really kind of emphasize the kind of agency when people do this kind of field work and go on their own terms and then try to approach theory. So I'm going to now I hope someone is keeping time, so I'm going to move quite fast. I'm just trying to get the next slide. So this is often the kind of view of how whether it's Kowloon or Bombay's scene, there's a framing of gentrification. Either you have to design for it, or then gentrification as a outcome of larger global capital is seen as an inevitable kind of a situation, which kind of locates all what's happening on the ground to be contingent to forces elsewhere. And rather, we are trying to argue that there is importance to theorize these spaces based on their territorial complexity. I keep pressing my mouse, but it's yeah. So this is something that you've already talked about in the introduction. So thank you very much for that. So I won't get into it, but basically we are trying to see whether terms like gentrification, urban renewal, speculative urbanism, do these kind of need to be revisited, and revisited through a kind of a very nuanced field work. I won't get into this because you've already talked about it and it's there in the abstract. And this is coming out of a kind of a exploration which a group of us have looked at. There are 4 of us who looked at this situation in both Kowloon and also Malad. Malad is Kowloon, as Professor Wing-Sheng Tang will explain, and is a very interesting site, a kind of a very thick site of various territorial contestations between British colonialism and mainland China. And Malad is something which is a very ubiquitous kind of area of what you see in Bombay, but also in other places. And also happens to be where it's Bombay's fastest growing region. So I'll now hand it over to Professor Wing-Sheng, and I will mute myself. Let me see if I can mute my Wing-Sheng. Would you like to take over? Can you see the slides? Yeah, I'm going to mute myself so that.
But I don't think I can manage the screen.
I will change the slide. You can just tell me when to change, and I will change it.
Okay. Now, what we are not, Soli and I are doing, are trying to show the complexity of the world, which is, beyond simply the dominant ideology of capitalism. So just to spell out some facts, that, for example, in the case of the Asian, the Chinese and East Asian economy, did exist actually before capitalism. One fact. The other fact is, for example, in terms of philosophy, there are a lot more. Now, besides the Western, besides the Chinese, of course, there's the Indian. Now, because of all these, then, an author called Link has put forward an idea that we have, taken it and then to elaborate for our own use, which is we will come back to it many times called differences without alienation. Yes, next, please. Sorry. Yes, I would start off with a simplified version of what Western philosophy, of what Western social science are. For example, you can see that, from Western philosophy, from the forgot how it is suddenly. Simply start off very early that Western philosophy is very much dominated by dualism. Now, then we saw it. There have been attempts trying to correct this dualism, be it, for example, Marx's dialectics, be it Gramsci's argument, be it from our more so-called spatial aspect is Henry Lefebvre, and then later Derrida's touching on differences. Now, all these I would argue, in a sense, is very mono development. Now, this has a lot of effect on the development of all disciplines that we are familiar, be it geography, history, sociology, economics, and politics. And even later, as time proceeds, we saw the development of area studies, including China studies. And all this would have, in a sense, following one path of development, which was very much affected by the development of Western philosophy. And thereby, although we see that later developments would be a lot of differences, nevertheless, we can see that behind it is rather more not monotonous philosophy. Now, if we put this into context, what is on the ground? Sorry, next slide. Now, on the ground, now I am simply using one example here. This is Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong, you can see the so-called lot of differences. On this the screen, we start from the very fringe to the very city center. Already in the fringe, we can see the difference, the complexity. For example, there would be indigenous people having the ownership. At the same time, the non-indigenous people are cultivating land owned by this indigenous people. Now, somewhere, so to speak, in the middle, we see the complexity as well. So, for example, here I show you the photo that we have numerous all these high rises, and this be either private or public. Now, the ownership could be in terms of by the government, and also managed by the so-called government department called Housing Authority. Now, then near the center, we see a lot more complexity, multiple tenants, multiple things, and then multiple ownerships, and then we saw the interaction of government ownership and then the private developer leases. Now, we emphasize the complexity. Nevertheless, as we later reiterate again and again, it's not the multiplicity that counts. We have been saying that it would be the difference, not the diversity. So next slide, please. Here, I show you the complexity of the land ownership in case of China, in case of Hong Kong, part of China, especially in the area before the British colonial occupation. For example, in terms of land, the complexity is the land itself. It's divided into topsoil and subsoil. The topsoil will be one set of owners, one set of users. the subsoil will be one set of another set. And in terms of ownership, depending on whether the owner and the tenant have registered their ownership and tenantship with the government. If they have done that, then it will be called red deed. If not, then white deed. Now, given this complexity, we can see on the far right, different types of individual on the topsoil, and then ancestor trust there would be ancestor trust with the topsoil, and then subsoil will be another set of persons, another set of ownership, another set of complexity. Next slide, please. Slowly. Now, we take this complexity, and if we focus ourselves on one particular location where we call, for example, the new Kowloon or in here, that's, in here, that's the area that has intensive, interaction between two different forces. Now, on the one hand, now, given the way that Hong Kong has been colonized, we have 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing, 1860, the Treaty of Beijing, Peking, and then 1898, the Convention that, so to speak, borrowed the new territory. As a result, we can see, two types of land ownership, and then really mess up. And this is most loomed large in the area, what we call the New Kowloon, including Sham. Now, of course, the complexity, if we dig into it, we will be see, even more so within, for example, within the Hong Kong side or within the new territory side. Next slide, please. Now, if we take into this complexity, and then how do we see the interaction? Now, here I have taken to represent this interaction complexity in terms of some kind of interaction. For example, at the very far left, we have, so to speak, the original state. In a sense, we have mostly the dominance of customary practice. Now, nevertheless, even within the dominant customary practice, there are other practices. They are always existing. As time proceeds, for example, during colonization, we see the changing complexity. For example, in the first stage, we see the private property will become more dominant, and then so to speak, the customary practice will be receding. Nevertheless, within each part, we still see the other parts existing. And so we can see that all this, basically continue changing and then becoming, and then we go to maybe at the present stage. Now, even at the present stage, we see, so to speak, the seeds of change for the next stage. Next slide, please. Now, as a result, then because of that, then perhaps we have to think differently with the way that we try to tackle the entanglement. Now, one important dimension of tackling it is to focus on space. So we are talking about maybe we have to take a second view on how to conceptualize space. Next slide, please. Now, if we go into the geographer's toolkit, we can see that for geographers, at least they said that there are at least 3 types of space. One is absolute, talking about a boundary that fixed within that boundary, that would be absolute space. For example, in a classroom, that will be within the classroom, that will be the absolute space. But that classroom is related to other classrooms within the university campus, and the way they link it up would be the relative space. Now, the third item is relational space. How do we see the classroom within the university, within the campus, and then this way that university had been set up, for example, in India? Now, that's the process behind it. That will be the relational space. Okay, next slide, please. Now, if we try to think of all this in a time and space dimension, then we can see the complexity. If, for example, we are interested in China, which would be at the far end, within it, if we are interested in Hong Kong, we can see the relationship between Hong Kong and other parts of China. And these would be in two dimensions. First of all, we have over there, and then here. And then in terms of time, will be past and present. Now, so the development, for example, Hong Kong and development China could not be understood in abstraction, in isolation with what is happening in the world. For example, in the case of Hong Kong, we see the relationship of with Britain, because as we just said, in 1842, Hong Kong was seized to Britain under the Treaty of Nanking. Now, nevertheless, that relationship with Britain will change over time as well, because Britain had developed over time. Now, here, once we talk about colonialism and the way that Hong Kong has been colonized, it is difficult not to mention about India, because Britain colonized India, and in that process, that type of relationship has been extended over Hong Kong as well, and that has been over time. And of course, if we want to complicate this picture, as China became socialized, and then we can add Soviet Union, and then Soviet Union will be in that kind of time and space in development. So in that way, if we think of it as a kind of spatial story, then we would be able to start to think of that kind of diachronic and synchronic interaction that we usually have been belittled in a lot of analysis. Okay, now in that perspective, within that perspective, we might have to rethink a lot of things. For example, the taken for granted capital logic. Usually, in the cases, we have one capitalism, and so the capital will start to proceed, and then we will so-called split in terms of concept, we call spatial fix, and because of that spatial fix, we will produce uneven geographical development across the world. So that's one logic. But if we sort of what I have said before, the China and East Asian economic network was developed even before capitalism arrived, then we start to think, actually, there are a lot more complexity. And so the capitalism will be only one part of it. There are others. Here, I call it, later we will talk about all the focus and field. So there will be one focus, capital. There will another focus. For example, we have gender. We have another focus will be class. Another gender will be, for example, like socialism. So it's the world is in that kind of continuous interaction. Next, please. So if that's the case, then we might want to start off, instead of following only the Western philosophy and then the Western social science to understand, for example, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and others. So we might have to, think of another way of doing it. Now, I put forward that called philosophy of Tongbian because what we want to emphasize is the mutual embeddedness that we have talked about in the last few slides. Tongbian philosophy is a Chinese philosophy. So it has adopted the Chinese intellectual tradition. The Chinese tend to emphasize on continuity through change. There's no transcendental order. Everything is changing. Everything is continuous to change. And here, how change has been done is through the two polarities called yin and yang, and then produce change. So we are talking about is not something dichotomous. We are not thinking about diversity. We have to think about the difference here. So how to understand their entanglement. Next slide, please. Sorry. I think the best way to start to understand the entanglement is through the yin-yang diagram. We have enlightened it a little bit in slide 2.6. Here, there are two parts. One is the yin and then one is yang. The important thing about it is even within the yin or within the yang, there's the yang and the yin in it. So, for example, in the white fish here, we have the black dot. The black dot is the part of the black fish. In the black fish, we have the white dot, which is part of the white fish. So it is this kind of you inside me and me inside you, and then this kind of interaction. So we are talking about a whole with two intrinsic forces. And these forces are mutually embedded into each other. And these two forces are continuously changing. And so that continuity, nevertheless change, and then in the process, it's becoming from one stage to another stage. Now, if that's the case, the important thing about it is we have to focus on the context if we want to elaborate that continuity, change, and becoming. So the point is not diversity. We don't want to talk about multiplicity per se. It's not that multiplicity per se, it's the difference between them. That the emphasis should be that. We don't see, we don't say that, besides capitalism, we have, say, for example, Asian version. We are emphasizing about the interaction between capitalism and the Asian, and then we see the differences, and then the complexity and the entanglement of these two. That is the emphasis. That is the important. So thereby we would emphasize again and again the importance of differences without alienation. We don't want to exclude the other. Next slide, please. Now, how to capture that mutual entanglement over time and across space? Now, I think of one thing is what we put forward is something called focus field relation. Now, focus, for example, here would be the central zone, and the field would be everything from the central zone to the north zone to the Pacific zone to the control zone to the right zone. So that whole thing is the field, and the middle one is the focus. And the thing is, this focus and field are always changing, always undergoing becoming and continuity. And the important thing is, how do we capture this kind of movement, the mutual embeddedness between the focus and the field, and everything changing. Next slide, please. As we said before, now we try to decipher the complexity using the concept of spatial story. First of all, we have done field work in the land urban development in one part of Hong Kong. So we try to capture from the past all the way to the future, and then we have taken into account by local field works and interrogation. We have all the local things. Now, nevertheless, this would be local, and this would be what we talk about would be more or less maybe the absolute. Nevertheless, we have to understand the relative as well as the relational. So we have to link it up to a higher level. Here, we talk about only at the urban level. Nevertheless, we would have like to explore even further to, for example, the whole Hong Kong context, and then Asia, and then the world. Next slide, please. Now, if we want to boil all this down into land, and then to employ the theoretical framework, conceptual framework of focus view to understand the dynamics of the mutual embeddedness, the entanglement, we can use two concepts. One is called land as property, and then the other is land as territory. Land as property is you can own this one, that's your ownership. And then the land as territory is that the particular government or person would have governance over the whole area, and then thereby affecting the way that people try to develop their property. Here, we simplify the thing, and then by talking about one focus, focus A. If we want to increase the complexity, then we have to, so to speak, draw similar diagrams for focus B, C, D, E, F, G, maybe all the way to Z. Now, certainly it's difficult to draw all this. So for simplicity, we would just focus on one focus, A. Now, even within the focus A, we can see the complexity because within it, the focus A may have, so-called governance over the territory. Now, within it, it will be the way to operate the property. Now, even within it, we can see, different individuals are involved in different aspects of that relationship. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, nevertheless, we have different types of tenureship. As a result, then even the individual 1, 2, and 3 are within the land as territory. Nevertheless, depending on the extent of that property spending over space, now that may give the differences between individual 1, 2, and 3. And in the same way, we are talking about different tenureship. So 4 and 5 would be completely different, would be very much different from 1, 2, and 3. Now, in a way, what we are proposing, what I mean is myself, Soli, and the two other authors, is to try to simplify the complexity of the mutual entanglement of the focus and field in a simple diagram. Next, please. Now, this one, I need to, Soli to elaborate it because it's talking about Mumbai. Sorry, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, just very quickly, and I'll show you some slides later on. But we picked up this territory of Malad because one of our co-authors, Prasad Shetty, he had done a very interesting, based on 9 court cases and also his own work as part of the MMRDA and also as a faculty in their school. It done a very interesting story of Bombay Talkies. Some of you may know who are interested in film studies. It was Asia's first film studio that operated between 1935 to about 82 or 85. But what is interesting about it is that as it evolved between various complexities of negotiations between the Parsi owners and the British colonial state, but also later on, more contemporary time, you have this layering of tenures and this constant switching of territory. And we found it very useful to mobilize the framework. So just as Wing Xing has mobilized it in Kowloon to show the complexity, he looks at a particular space, which he'll show slides of, a place called Boundary Street, which, as the name suggests, it was the boundary between the British and the Chinese control. We picked up this area through various historical sources of Nikhil Rao and two or three other very contemporary historians who take this kind of territorial switching more seriously. Unlike the earlier historians of land, who tend to take the settlement of property through the kind of Bengal, settlement system. Whereas in a lot of relatively, newer work shows these kind of territories to be continually unsettled. And this is something I just want to emphasize. So I'm going to come back to this, but I just wanted to kind of make a point that we tended to look at the materiality of this through electricity, water bills, various kind of regulations, which shape tendencies in complicated ways. So I'm going to now mute my.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so given what Solly is talking about the molasses Mumbai, I just want to show you a few slides to show, so to speak, the complexity of Hong Kong, in particular the case studies around the Boundary Street. And we have shown the diagram how that complexity, where we have different tenures and then different territory, land of territory, and then even land of property. Next slide, please. So this show how the complexity of that land. Next slide, please. Now, now we have shown you the complexity on the ground. What we have been arguing is the literature has not been able to unravel these complexities. Sometimes even they might argue that there is not only the Western territory. There is for example, the South Asian. There is the Indian. There's the thing. Nevertheless, they still tend to emphasize the concept of multiplicity. What we have been arguing all along is not multiplicity per se. That is our emphasis. It's the interaction between them, among them. That is our emphasis, the mutual entanglements. So the other thing is, here we have talked about the two concepts, land of territory and land of property. We did not invent them ourselves. We drew on the author. Nevertheless, her way of conceptualize these are, some kind of discrete elements no interaction, no relationship, no. The final one, the third point that we want to emphasize is that another Roy has to question the concept of planetary urban. In that he tried to emphasize the importance of space, important land as the prime urban question, which is what we have been doing. Next slide, please. Now, to summarize my part of the presentation, I had written a paper that tried to argue that we know that in the literature, there is something called critical analysis. But I want to emphasize is, given our case studies of Malad, Mumbai, and then Kowloon, Hong Kong, we come to the conclusion that we might even have to challenge the critical literature because they have not thought of things critically. They still rely on maybe one set of theory, one set of concepts to argue their critical things. We need to really go to ground and then develop our own so-called critical analysis. So I will end my part and then we'll give the rest of the time to Shui to elaborate many more concepts by using the Malad and the Mumbai case. Shui, your floor.
Yeah, thank you. Wing-Ching, is it okay if I mute you? Is that, and then, or we can, if you're in an enclosed room, I can just keep it on, whatever you prefer. Yeah, okay. And Ritu, can you just tell me how much more time I have? Do I have about 7 minutes or 10, something like that?
Yes, sir, please go ahead.
Yeah.
You have 15 minutes you can take.
Okay, great. So we picked up Malad for with several reasons. One is all of us had been there in many different kind of constellations. And it's a fascinating place because as you can see, I hope you can all see this particular image, which shows a kind of collage of different things happening. Of course, you have the tall pencil, which are, by the way, inspired from Hong Kong, the pencil tower kind of multi-stories. You have one of Bombay's, if it's not biggest, Bombay's biggest fish market, but you also have various entanglements of court cases, property conflicts, and it seemed to be a sort of a fascinating site to kind of explore and kind of evolve our kind of theoretical understanding. It also happens that this was also a place where people, I'm mentioning Sanghaveshwar, Nikhil Rao in particular, Miriam Dosal, who had done work on her book, Theatres of Conflict, which I would say is a pioneering work to set this form of looking at the history of these kind of territorial conflicts. And Nikhil Rao makes a point that many of the early subaltern studies group sort of missed out these terrains because they had in the back of the mind a kind of completeness of the settlement of property. And therefore, these kind of textures and actual politics of how territory remained and still remains unsettled in most of Bombay, that got missed out. Now, one of the things about this is that I started to, return to an earlier work where we've been kind of understanding that a lot of cities are not within the master planning framework. Of course, they are affected by it, but there is a kind of assumption among South Asian urban scholars and on post-colonial writing that somehow the master planning as a frame, which comes from sort of British colonial kind of ideas of planning the city to control and discipline the natives, to town planning, which was seen as a way to distribute certain resources. And that slips into US, particularly US, not even because North American sort of quote unquote, involves Canada, but particularly US style of land use planning, which then sets the frame for everything else that happens. So you have a kind of a binary where you have a kind of a planned city, and then everything else that is happening is in its sort of a oppositional kind of flavor. Now, this becomes very problematic because then the kind of complexities that we see on the ground, which gets revealed through, for example, this wonderful story form of an essay about a particular Parsi trader who happened to be the biggest landowner in Karachi, because he was, and that status was always troubling the colonial authorities. So they decide to help him resettle to Bombay. And then he becomes Bombay's biggest landowner, owning 4,000 acres. But then soon, as you can see, when we started to get into the details, and I would encourage a lot of people to, read the work of the relatively newer historians. It's, according to me, it's much more fresh. It might seem unsettled, but if you're dealing with an unsettled territory, that's what you're going to get. And I think that becomes exciting in terms of how, in this particular case, and I've given the link here, Prasad Shetty's work on the Bombay talkies gets played out. Now, what we decided to do, and here is a kind of limitation to some of the historian work, is that by the time they hit about 1980, 1990, 1985, suddenly the idea of neoliberalism takes over, which is a kind of a hegemonic role, which basically places everything on the path to global capital. However, if you look at the material processes, just as Wing-Shing was emphasizing the details of complexity, you get quite a complicated story. You find that actually territory is increasingly unsettled. And when you get into the court cases and look at various kind of property conflicts, a much more nuanced story emerges. It's also very interesting that, and this is not normally realized unless you are one of these wheeler-dealer lawyers, or you're an architect, just as are two of our co-authors, Prasad Shetty and Rupali Gupte were, where they're dealing with various community groups, negotiating with both various parts of the Maharashtra state government, but also the BBMP, the BMC, and also various kind of touts and agents who play with these kind of regulations which actually shape how land gets transformed. So you will see in yellow there, the small repairs law, section 33/7, 37/7A. You have all these kind of bureaucratic language, which seems boring on the first glance. But if you get into the system of how this play gets played out, this is actually an extremely exciting world, because it talks about how property is constantly switching between a yin and a yang, or one part of it getting empowered at the cost of the other, but still having a seed in the first. And this is something which, well, most of you will have to wait to see, hopefully see the details of this article that we have written, where we've tried to trace how this, what Wing-Shing was talking about, the movement of the circle of the yin-yang between the switching, but also the expansion of one at the cost of the other, while still maintaining the seed. So the importance of difference without alienation. And I think this is a very interesting area which requires far more nuanced work, expanding the archives, not just the historical archives, but the archives that come out of everyday court practices, out of municipal politics, out of politics of urban development, which can help you explore this. Now, these are next few slides are basically more of this. But I just wanted to make a point that this kind of terrain calls for a very on the ground kind of research, which unfortunately in the way research power structures work within academia, we normally leave all this quote unquote, what is seen to be dirty work for the field researchers, while in the research hierarchy, the senior people are sitting somewhere else and theorizing based on some kind of received theory, which makes for instant publication in terms of publication politics. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that there is a politics of knowledge generation which works against quote unquote younger researchers or older researchers like me going to the field, and at the cost of trying to get something published. And I think the important new part is precisely on the point where you have to really dig into things, you have to work out, and then you have to have almost get into these kind of circulars, very kind of almost unreadable, and I would say illegible, opaque archives, which are necessarily so, because if these kind of archival spaces, which are everyday living spaces, are also what small developers use against very big ones, then it would be foolish for them to be very transparent. So I think there's a point that always in these kind of stories, you're kind of glimpsing the politics. You're never really able to settle it because that is what the terrain is about. But that is also what makes it so exciting to look at. For example, you can get into court cases, and some of our friends, Pushkar Shivam, who's looked at a part of Bangalore, has explored mid-level and lower-level courts in terms of how court judgment, but also negotiations that happen within the courtroom, but also outside the courtroom, start to shape these kind of contests. So I'm just laying out a kind of terrain, a thickness of terrain, what is sort of explored through the Tongbian way. And this obviously calls for a kind of a approach which is very different from what I would call the easy narrative, which got popularized in Bombay, including Malad, by USAID and HDFC and several other kind of finance companies who wanted to see Bombay as a kind of sign of city productivity. And so you get the usual kind of social science framing, which basically talks about all the big moves. You don't get any of the textures, and basically all the complex part gets slotted as social housing, slums, and informality, which then becomes part of kind of rehabilitation package. If you can see on the right-hand corner here, these kind of blocks. And if any of you are familiar from Bombay, the kind of rehousing in Mankod and all these kind of areas. And the only other thing happening is the Mindspace, IT complex, InOrbit Mall, and the various kind of financial deals. But there's much more than that. And I think there's also kind of a reason why this kind of easy narrative came. And Seng, who's written about this, both in the context of Indonesia and Hong Kong, talks about a lot of urban literatures from the 60s, which developed this kind of narrative in the context of the Cold War. So I just want to kind of lay this ground because this is often forgotten, that many of the terms, whether it's from squatters to slums and informal housing, have this history which come from both Latin America, but also Southeast Asia. And this I found recently, and I was kind of very excited to find out, because I was always very uncertain about why is it that these terms came. And I think Seng's work is very important. And this is important because one might think that, oh, this is all kind of 60s kind of stuff, but that's not true at all. Because if you look at very contemporary kind of discussions, whether it's from World Bank reports, they are using almost exactly the same kind of language, the anxiety about the urban, the fear about the urban, they're trying to capture it as slums, informal versus the high rise, this kind of binary viewed in this picture as what Seng is talking about. So there's a kind of contemporariness of this, and while you might have the World Bank types, right? This is the World Bank kind of framing. Look at what the critical geographers are doing. They're doing exactly the same. So here you have a proposal to the National Science Foundation. And if you look, I just picked up text from the proposal. You can Google it yourself. Again, the framing is that you're going to have this global city where there's going to be city civil unrest, where you're going to have young people revolting. And of course, maybe that is important for them to get the bucks, but they even said it's threatening to US interests. Now, this sort of is a very, this kind of, to put it bluntly, when you get the narrative wrong, it's not, there are consequences beyond just academia. Because we've also had in Bangalore where somewhat linked to this, you have a policing of youth groups where not even 4 kilometers where I am sitting right now, if there are 4 people, young men, I'm particularly saying that, who congregate in a particular place like a small adda, they're likely to be defined as a hot spot and picked up by the police. Okay, and linked to a GIS and G-Sync kind of a program. So I'm just kind of making a point that it's very important to get the theory right and the analysis on the basis of that theory correct. Because otherwise what one happens is that, in making these kind of broad statements about, how global capitalism is going to change, avoids this kind of it doesn't allow this kind of a subtle shift of territory and process. Now, I'll just quickly end, but I just want to say that this is not just in Bombay or, Hong Kong or Kowloon or Malad, but there are works which try to get into this complexity. Here's an example from Taipei by Anya Bernstein, who does kind of very rich ethnography within the city hall and reveals very similar nuances of urban law, which has its genesis both in Japanese, American colonialism, and Chinese colonialism. So you have this layering in that case of three layers which are coming about because of the particular history of Taiwan. So I just want to, and this is again coming from Brazil, where field work by Bovantera Santos or many researchers, unnamed researchers under him. This is the recent controversy that's come out, and hence I put there many unnamed Miss Bovantera Santoses. Some of you might want to Google on this. But my point is this, that this kind of intensity of everyday life, which is worked into legal processes, is a very different one than constitutional law. There's a very interesting debate by Pratap Banu Mehta and Veena Das. It's on YouTube, by the way. It's set in 2011. It's a lecture, I think, on the Ambedkar one, where Mehta makes an argument that to understand everyday processes of claim making in Delhi, you have to look at these kind of intersectional spaces rather than constitutional ones. I'll encourage you all, if some of you are interested, email me and I'll send that link. So it's a very interesting discussion by Mehta, who argues for this kind of nuances. And again, we put Southern in quotes, but if you look at Toronto, okay, a city where I spent some few years, you have exactly this kind of a complexity of dynamic land regulation kind of processes. This is a order from 2009, and I discovered this in 2000. Discovered this means encountered this by colleagues who are architects and community architects. They kept telling me about it in downtown Toronto in 2006 and 7, but it comes officially into play in 2016 and 17. So I'm going to end with this, and I've just put this here just to break this idea that it's only, the global South. It's also happening in the global North. And this is a particular issue which affects housing for a huge amount of people in the downtown Toronto, but also the greater Toronto area. So I'm going to end here, and let me see how to stop sharing. Yeah. Here we are. So we can take questions, and I'm just going to remove my headphones to get my notebook so I can note down the questions. Just a minute.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Benjamin and Professor Wang. Well, before I open the floor for discussion, I'm sure there's a lot of questions because the presentation was full of field work, enriching experience, and the amount of work which has been done over the years, using various field sites and understanding about theoretical framework. I think in chat box, we still have not received any questions, but maybe we can ask people to just either raise their hands or whatever. But I just quickly want to say a few things before I open the floor for discussion. I was also thinking of my own understanding. I think 2-3 things which, if I understand it correctly, which came very clearly is that the differentiation you make between the land as a property and the land as a territory. And I think in case of China, as far as my understanding goes, this difference has been resolved very significantly because the state has taken over the land, especially after the socialist era, and therefore the ownership patterns were not that problematic as it is in the case of India and other countries. And especially, and I don't know about India. I mean, I also want to ask this question whether the land tenure arrangements in India are properly being laid out or properly been written. As in the case in other countries, maybe there are land revenue system which actually clearly talk about the land right system. That is one. Second point, yeah, I can see Professor Mohanty want to come in. Just second point is that is the land essentially a local project, or is it as you yourself is saying the land use planning take place from the top, but there's so much happens at the local level. So there are series of actors, stakeholders, contestation which takes place over this land as a territory and also as a property. So what about so the quickly the last point is that land is a kind of a is a process in which it has been made flexible through the state ownership program, though it was considered to be a fixed territory. And then how the various process of centralization, decentralization, territorialization, reterritorialization, displacement, relocation takes place continuously. So I will come back to Tongbian philosophy later. Let me open the floor for discussion. Well, Professor Mohanty wants to comment. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think this is something I have been waiting for. I had missed some of the earlier presentations by Soli. And I will say that this is exactly what we call creative theory. And, breaking the kind of dualities we have inherited, and I would still say the propulsions, theoretical propulsions during colonial period and during the post-colonial period, which have pushed us in continuing the unidimensional, unilinear theories and models in all fields, including in urbanization. Thank you very much. And this Tongbian mutual embeddedness, or this entangled situated histories, these are exactly the concepts that we need for creative theory to help us to address the nuances, the complexities that we are talking about. I have one comment and one question. The comment is, you are still situating this dynamic embeddedness, mutual embeddedness in the global south, even though you gave some examples from Toronto and so on later on. In fact, I would suggest that this exactly should be applied globally. In other words, in all histories, there are these layers of relationships and interactions, and we have to capture them. And the grand narratives, or even the critical narratives, which a reductionist, had to be questioned. Therefore, I mean, that would be my comment, to make it a universally applicable framework, not just in third world situations. And the question is about the, the way, Tang Wing Sing, he put it particularly as the Chinese intellectual tradition. Now, the yin-yang framework can also lead to a dualistic framework. And you have to also break the yin-yang dualism into not multiplicities, as you have rightly critiqued, but the contextual, historical interactions. Because I have a general understanding, and this is corroborated in my view by your studies, that functional interdependencies govern transitions. That's why when you say continuity, change, and becoming, I would add unbecoming, by the way, solely. So continuity, change, becoming, unbecoming, unless you subsume unbecoming within becoming, that's also possible. In other words, all that happens because of functional interdependencies, which may be apparent and may not be. You can discover those interdependencies, the roots, the inheritances, the solid standing blocks, and so on. So these happen everywhere. I mean, if you have the Western, what did you call it? The tall building, the matchstick.
The pencil tower.
Pencil building, yeah. The pencil building and the so-called slum, or whatever it is. And if the Jawaharlal Nehru Millennium Urbanization Plan had been continued, then we would have in situ buildings, another tall building with the workers of that area also staying there. So two complementing tall buildings, but both artificially projected to serve a particular system. I can go on because I'm really excited by your presentations, but one more comment, and that is by the way, today is my geographer's day. Later on, I have another geographer of your kind, but a Marxist theoretician, Raju Das from York University. He's speaking to a research methodology course that I'm part of here. In Bhubaneswar, by the way, I'm located. So my question is, space, what you have really done is reconceptualized civilization and dynamics of a civilization's history. And when capitalism, and this is the point I want to make, studies of capitalism can be very dualistic, unilinear, and so on. Study of colonialism and capitalism can be far more complex. I think the many mechanical Marxists and subalterns have reduced such studies into very, very sort of sharp categories. They have helped us to understand some of the forces, but as your studies show, they have not helped us to capture those nuances which you people, and now the entire creative theory group is engaged in trying to capture. Therefore, don't say under capitalism or under neoliberalism, all this was ignored. The mainstream may have ignored them, but there are many studies who precisely try to capture them. Thank you. Congratulations for these studies.
Thank you. Wing Ching, would you like to, or should we take a group of questions? How should we?
No, sir, you can go ahead, answer this question first.
Wing Ching, would you like to respond?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should take a few more questions and then answer later, isn't it?
Okay. Then let's go like this.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a next question by
We have a raised
Professor.
hand from Atria D.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Atria? I thought I saw a raised hand from Atria D.
And till the time she comes back,
Yeah.
The person had got logged out. He's entering.
Okay.
should I take another question?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
There are a couple of questions talking about elaborating your discussion on difference without alienation. That is one. Second is all about the variegated capitalism, which claims to take into account the provincial dynamism vis-a-vis Tongbian philosophy and your critique of universalizing theory of capitalism. So these two questions are in chat box, and third is on depending on how do you perceive the imposition of hukou under the Tongbian philosophy, and how do you look at the town-country relations? If hukou has become do you think hukou has become a kind of an impediment to this, town-country relations category? Then there are, of course, Rija, you can ask question on your own. Rija, you want to come now?
Sure, ma'am. Sure. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. So thank you, Professor Benjamin and Professor Thang, for a very interesting presentation. So my question is pertaining to the thickness of property that you had mentioned earlier, and the situated land tenures that you said operates within the urban rural spaces. So for instance, sitting from Delhi, I can say that within Delhi alone you see multiple land tenures operating at the same time. You see the Bhaichara system operating within the urban villages of Munirka, Shapurjat and Kishangarh, which is basically a spillover from the colonial land tenure systems in India. So what I wanted to know is that, do you see such similar colonial spillovers or similar challenges to land ownership or usage across China, basically operating within the informal realm? Thank you.
Is Dr. Atria there, or we should go ahead with answering these questions first? Maybe, sir, you answer this question first. We have a couple of them here.
Yeah, Wing Ching, would you like to start?
Okay. Maybe I start to say a few words. I think for us, as Sori and I have argued in another paper, a published one, is that there should be something like a north-south divide. We see, because as we argue all along, is that we want to emphasize the difference. We emphasize the north and the south, and we emphasize the relationship. So we emphasize the mutual entanglement. So there is no such thing as there should be a south and there should be the north, things like that. Now that applies to another, we argue, another common misconception is that theory is usually done in the north, and the south is only responsible for empirical analysis. Now, we have argued that if that's the case, it's really different with alienation. So what we are trying to argue is that the empirical studies, so to speak, is part of theorization. So we are not just interested in so-called micro and understanding per se. We are actually trying to theorize what is the difference. And that difference, it look respect to within the so-called theoretical understanding. So I think that applies to all this, what we call the diversity. We are not arguing that we don't like it. We argue against it. We want to difference, and then we want to recognize all the differences, and the differences should be really spelled out as detailed as possible. I think this is my general comment on all these things, and I think Soli we would be able to capture and then elaborate a lot more in details. Soli.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very quickly, I think I'll just start with what Ritu asked about the complexity of land tenure, and then also that links to Rija's point. I think the interesting thing about looking at this historical material around Malad, but also other works by other historians that are more contemporary. I'm talking of post 2016, 17, which kind of point out that this assumptions that land was settled by British colonialism needs to be kind of questioned. What is interesting about the Malad case is that it starts with complex entanglements from the way the Marathas and the Mughal empires, sort of, which were at a distant, kind of attempted to control this kind of coastal territory. Then you have the Portuguese coming in. Now, they were not really interested in revenue generation. They were more interested as quote unquote pirates to keep some kind of forts over there and then attack the surpluses of British and Spanish fleets. And then you have the British coming in through these figures of the various Parsi landowners who again continually confront this kind of unsettled territory. And it's only by land reclamation, which is how Nikhil Rao's later work focuses on, that you actually have some kind of planning happening, right? Because they can't even what I found interesting, that right up to the 1890s, they couldn't quote unquote even enter the native towns of Bombay. Right? There were revolts. People were going and burning up the record offices because they didn't like the way they were being, tagged. A whole lot of politics, and that also gets played out in the way the Gulf, the sort of management of the global plague, which comes in from Hong Kong, comes to Bombay, then moves to Alexandria, and then moves on to Mexico City. So even in that, you can see this constant kind of unsettled terrain. And if you take some of the Portuguese and British land tenures, they kind of took on this hybrid forms. So you have this kind of interesting situation where even right up to contemporary times, the way we understand regulatory practices. So to make a point like harder, Ritu, the point about land tenures, you have the role of electricity authorities, where each of you, based on where you're sitting, would be given an electrical connection, which affects on an as-is various basis, irrespective of are you the landowner or are you a tenant or a subtenant. And it starts to create categories to extend electricity. And if you have a shop, or if you're going to do something with the bookshelves behind you, to open up a small shop on that, and you need high-powered LED lights for that. I'm just making it up, obviously. That negotiation with the electricity authority, the parchi that they give you, becomes not just with you, but with a whole lot of people, a category of land tenure. And that becomes your claiming onto a system based on your negotiations with the landlord of your place or with the subtenant or the tenant. And this kind of thickness of property coming out through practice with the electricity authority, which I just want to emphasize is a non-elected body, but it is doing so because it wants revenue, starts to be a generative space. This is in India, but also in Brazil. So the works that come out of the Boaventura Santos group, and I'm purposely saying it's a group of people, is precisely on this kind of an issue. And so this kind of makes a point that land tenure is not just a revenue department category, right? Normally, if you're kind of setting a research agenda saying that, oh, you're going to look at land tenure and then you go into that's not enough just to look at those ones, but to rather look at these as kind of live spaces which have this kind of complexity of fieldwork that is called on. And hence, if you, to just twist the conversation a bit more onto two questions that were asked. One was about variegated capitalism, and the second one was about the thickness of land tenure. You're talking of the Bhaichara system in Delhi. I remember in areas of Bhogal and Lajpat Nagar where I had done my work, but also I think there was always a play. I remember seeing a very nice PhD thesis that came out of JNU. I'm forgetting her name, which looked at near the Qutub Minar. I'm suddenly forgetting the name of that. No, this is near the. Sushmita work also, but I'm talking about the one which is near, where you have all these heritage walks near the Qutub Minar. That so there was an interesting thesis that looked at the complexity of property there, and it was constantly kind of remade. Now, if you put that as part of variegated capitalism, you're already locked onto this main dominant tree, of which different kind of, because if you look at where the term variegated comes from, right? It's a type of it's a ficus tree. So you'll have a temple tree, a banyan tree, etc., but it's still a ficus species. So you already defined a kind of a main capitalism, which is landing in different parts of the global south, generating its own political economies. But those political economies, so you have local politics while global capital. You already got a binary. And therefore, if you look at works which use this kind of framing when they enter Jakarta, so there's the work of Eric Shepard. I can send you the articles if some of you are interested. Eric Shepard and Helga Leitner and others who are looking at Jakarta particularly, which has a very interesting land history going to the 70s, 80s in terms of the Kampong Improvement Program, etc. As Abedin Khusru's done, that this word, informal and, slum settlement just don't make sense in Jakarta because you have particular types of kampong. So again, he's making an argument, and Seng is making an argument that this word informal slums and all came out of the US Cold War kind of a situation. And that's those same terms are being used by a particular type of critical thinkers who are looking at variegated capitalism, who then mobilize it because they don't have any other terms to be able to nuance it. And when they do refer to these other terms, those are made contingent on meta-capitalism. So I think that it's very important to take your fieldwork and have confidence in the thickening of fieldwork, what it opens up, and then using that to then question some of these dominant frames. I feel this is not an easy process, because suppose you want to develop some interesting fieldwork generated concepts and you want to get published. and you're not sure whether your reviewers are going to allow you to do that, then how do you deal with that as a crisis? I mean, that's a whole issue about the politics of the publication industry, where if you use catchy words which are in the flavor of the month, you have posh language, hopefully not chat GBT, maybe it is, then you get published because it's a kind of easy narrative, right? And it's important in terms of academic careers. But what does it do? What does it tell you about people who are researching in their own context, on their own terms, who are not fitting the bill? So, I mean, that's a kind of separate issue, but I think that's what our work is also trying to, point a kind of or raise questions about. I'm just, I think Wing Xing has messaged me saying that he may have to leave early for a medical appointment. But I just wanted to, and of course, I'm not an expert on this, but from some of the work I've read on the huku, is that you do have the huku, which is in common parlance, the kind of residency certificate, being a highly contested space. And it also depends, are you talking about a huku in Guangzhou? Are you talking near it to Beijing, as I was told once? Are you talking in various other parts of China? How far the state is, or one part of the state is, which may shape that. So I think all these categories, one has to kind of approach from to treat them as open-ended, indeterminate space, where indeterminate is not a bad thing. It gives you the possibility to play around with that concept based on what you're finding on the ground and not be too disciplined. I think it's kind of horrible when PhD scholars who are just going to embark on their fieldwork are told that, you better have your literature review and you better have your research questions fixed in stone, which is crazy, because I think some of the most interesting work, both on India and China, have come out where people have changed their research questions based on what they found in the field. So I think let me just see whether I just want to thank Manu Mohanty. I mean, it's been increasingly, he's always been very supportive of this kind of work, and thank you very much, sir. So I'm just trying to say, I'm trying to struggle with the questions, which ones I missed and all. Yeah, you're right, Meroli. And
yeah, most of the thing are done, except
yeah.
Atriya Day is still there, that she can ask her question, because
Yes, please do. Please do.
Otherwise I'll just bind up, because as you said,
And also
Professor
you
Bhakti
can
also.
email the questions, if things are obviously things are not clear, and we can respond to them over the next few weeks.
Yes, so maybe we yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, I had spoken to you about this previously also in a seminar in IIT Madras, and currently I'm doing my PhD in urban sociology in IIT Bombay. Now, my question percolates from my interest in smart cities. And first thing is the fact that you told that colonial land tenures had obviously taken the property regimes in cities like Bombay and Calcutta, from where I come, as very settled land tenures. But when I look at the Bengal Delta, for example, or Dilip D. Kunha's work in the context of Bombay, which is again estuarine soil, and now that pre-urbanization is happening in this context, we see the unsettlement is very, indeterminacy is very contemporary as we do field work. So
yes,
in that context, I am thinking, like, when I see land formations changing every day, the fact that I return home every 6 months and I see a new kind of a landform, new soil textures, how do I approach the field in that context? Because then anything I write makes no sense tomorrow when I present something in my APS, and the next APS, I cannot resonate with my panel members, and this is something which has been troubling me a lot. Of course, my faculty members clearly told me to attend this specifically for the approach that you guys have been taking up for some time. And secondly, I am also interested in the politics of infrastructure, and how infrastructure shapes our future, shapes the future of cities. And here, the promise of cities is very deeply linked with the promise of infrastructure. And I'm talking, coming from position Akhil Gupta and Hannah Appel, comes in their work on promise of infrastructures. So when there is this conjecture that infrastructure creates in a smart city, how to even methodologically approach that before I have a final resonance regarding my research question, which I can then pitch in my proposal. These are the two questions, because otherwise it looks extremely reductionist to even talk about multiplicity, because then that can lead to a very double-edged sword kind of a thing. So these are the two questions I had.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think very quickly, I think some of the work by Simone, Abu Malik Simone, talks precisely on the complexities of how infrastructure is made and remade in different realms, right? And he doesn't, what is valuable about his work and several other people, and we've also learned a lot from his work, is to not separate it out from human action. And I'm not talking about humans as atomized individuals, where you can do a kind of political science kind of a read, where you can do a survey and you find out so many percentage of people did this, etc. But rather various constellations of groups. So people are constantly working in groups. I mean, I think that is one important point. So while there has been a huge upsurge and a very welcome upsurge of an ethnography of these kind of spaces, especially in Bombay, I think the most interesting parts of them are the ones where they look at these spaces of creating infrastructure in the way it matters in everyday way from groups of people, not just individuals, right? Whom do you know? You have a relative in the government. You get a estimate about what the public works is in that area. You can lobby the contractor through the councillor to move an infrastructure on an area that has not been notified for improvement, which according to one of the Supreme Court judgments said that if you put in infrastructure in illegal areas, it's like paying a thief. It's like rewarding a thief, right? But this is constantly happening. Now, the interesting thing about infrastructure, as I mentioned in the electricity case, and this is what I researched in Shadra, East Delhi, is that at that time, the Desu, this is before it got split up into 3 different parts, and now there's talk about again rejoining it. The whole kind of electricity connections that were happening were all tenurial forms, and in terms of what you could do with it, whom got it, and how, if you take which is to my knowledge most concretely manifested in the Bombay case as recently as 2017, where you have the form of the pagadi system entangling both the tenant and the subtenant, what they call tenant in first part, tenant in second part, and the quote unquote landowner, assuming you can find out where they are, which is the other complexity. And this being entangled in the negotiations to extend infrastructure. My point is this, that the entanglement of infrastructure and the entanglement of land tenure are not very different. They're just 2 sides of the same coin. And if infrastructure is peopled in a particular way as constellation of people, so you have land tenure also being peopled in another way. And I think maybe your, I sort of sense a kind of anxiety in your question. Maybe the anxiety is coming from the issue that you're trying to look for a complete kind of a story. I feel in all of our kind of more ethnographic work, one thing that we've learned is that there's never going to be a complete coherent story. And that can be, even if I ask you, suppose I'm asking you about your family, about your income or your parents' income or the property that is there in your family, you will never tell me a complete story, right? I mean, why should you? Who am I to ask you? So if you go to someone else and ask them, why should they tell her? Because how do they know whom you are connected with? How is it going to be used? So I think there's one issue here is that this incompleteness, I think one has to approach the city from that sensibility. And I'm always very suspicious of grand theories which have a kind of almost a predictable end, when you start to read for example, if you read a kind of a kind of a work, a written work, which is not premised on, to put it crudely, just for the sake of our arguments right now, on solid work, they will almost always give a suggestion that they've cracked the issue. Okay, so it sounds like a bit like IIT, where you've gamed it, you've cracked it, and you know where the crisis of capitalism lies. Okay, and that's kind of settled. You read the first paragraph, you read the last paragraph, and then you really almost don't need to read the rest of the paper. So I think the interesting thing is where things are unsettled because as I have several students from Kerala or from Tamil Nadu, there are terms in Malayalam, in Tamil, in Hindi for sure. In a Shadra Hindi, it was different from other parts of Hindi. That's where I learned my Hindi. There are terms which are very particular to places. I mean, people, use metaphors so powerfully. And I think that's the value of stories. That's the value of poetry. That's the value of films. If you take the politics that is coming out of Tamil rap music or Bombay, again rap, these are important spaces, and these show that we have to take these spaces, seriously. It's not just culture which comes in as a kind of illustration. Sorry.
I think, Professor, it is so enriching that we need to have more sessions with you to listen to have more case studies about Bangalore. And I was looking at your work, which is, so enriching and extensive. So I think, but we have to, put a kind of a close to this session now. And I think Yukti is waiting to conclude it. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. I would like to take your permission to conclude the session, if that is all right with you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So with this, we shall wrap today's Wednesday seminar. We would like to thank Dr. Wing-Ching Thang and Dr. Solomon Benjamin and Dr. Ritu Agarwal for gracing today's session with their presence and giving their precious time and insightful knowledge towards this topic, which is not really mainstream and not many people will know about it. So it's quite knowledgeable to hear about. The recording of the session will be available on our YouTube channel. And also, we would like to ask you all to please join us for our next seminar on the topic panel discussion on revisiting the May 4th movement, discourse and narratives. It will be happening next Wednesday. So thank you for tuning in today. We will see you next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you all. Thank you all very. Thank you, Ritu, and thank you, Rija.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you. Okay.